And welcome back. Now, protests this week at the University of the Witwatersrand have highlighted the crisis in higher education funding. Students feel that government and the National Student Financial Aid Scheme have failed them. However, higher education institutions say that they do not have funds to assist all needy students, and the many students that are out protesting want WITS and other institutions to allow them to register even though they have historical debt, and this all on the back of an ailing economy, 32.5% joblessness in the country, and what really seems like no resolution to the problem at this stage. So let's discuss this further now with the Higher Education Deputy Director General of Universities, Dr. Thandi Lewin. Thanks so much for your time this morning. Welcome to Morning Live.
Morning, Sakina, and morning to your viewers.
Dr. Lewin, the question, the first and most obvious question is, here we are again. Students are protesting again. Why?
So, yeah, that's a really important question, and we really hope that, with some of the resolution of some of the matters during this week, that we might be able to, to restore calm at our institutions and try and get the academic year underway. There are very real issues for many students. What the minister announced yesterday, however, was that Cabinet had taken a decision that it would be possible for the department to reprioritize money to ensure that the shortfall that we were facing on the NSFAS funding for this year is addressed. And now what that means is that the first-year students who we had NSFAS had been unable to confirm funding for, that those students would now be able to register, and the academic year can get underway. So addressing some of those issues, we hoped would resolve some of the conflict. I think there are, of course, students that are not NSFAS qualifying, and there are students that have debt. What we would say really is to urge that the negotiations between the SRCs and the management teams of institutions are allowed to go ahead. Many institutions do have plans in place to address the debt of students, to provide additional funding to support the missing middle students in particular, those students who don't qualify for NSFAS. And we really hope that those negotiations can continue and that we can get back to class.
Dr. Lewin, the problem right now is that we've already seen one person lose their life. There have been injuries to others. And the question is, why wasn't this dealt with before it got to this point? Surely everything that you have just told us now should have been discussed. It should have been anticipated beforehand.
Yeah, that's a very fair question, and just to say that the technical work around this issue has been ongoing for some time. The department working with NSFAS, that there are really very serious issues around the numbers that had to be verified, and of course you will know that we had a very difficult academic year last year. We had an extended academic year, so many students were continuing with their studies, even up until quite recently. There were various catch-up programs across the system, and examinations and catch-up programs, and some universities have only just finished the academic program. So this meant that there were both financial and other issues that had to be looked at. So that was the one thing, but it is something that we've been working on for some time. The other thing that's really important is that the Department of Higher Education and Training could not make these decisions on its own, and the decisions had to be taken at a higher level, and therefore the work had to be done in order to, when you have issues that are finance related and that have policy implications, they did have to be discussed at a higher level. So that work also had to be done.
So did those discussions, did they actually take place with Treasury and other departments, as you say, at a higher level? Because surely you were aware of the shortfall that was going to ensue, because if you look at the situation as it played out in that court case with UNISA, where the court has reviewed and set aside that application by the Higher Education Ministry, the instruction rather, I should say, that UNISA reduced the intake of first-year students by 20,000. So that is indicative of the fact that you were aware that you were going to have a funding shortfall. So take us through what those discussions were about and why you didn't communicate earlier about the sort of problems that you knew were going to ensue.
So, the money actually has been identified, and really budget processes do take time, and they require certain processes. So we did have to engage with National Treasury. We did have to look across government, and in fact, I think that you will know that we're facing a very difficult fiscal situation as a country, and in fact, all departments have been cut. I mean, there have been reductions to the budgets of all government departments. And so that is the situation that we're facing. So it's really a question of trying to understand the numbers, and maybe also to indicate that one of the challenges that we face is that we are, aware that given the COVID-19 situation, that the demand for funding on the NSFAS scheme has increased, and of course, there are likely to be higher numbers of students that are qualifying for NSFAS this year, who then register at universities, and so one also has to take into account those numbers.
So, do you have any sort of estimate right now of exactly what the shortfall in funding is for NSFAS? Those students who would like to access NSFAS funding.
We do. Obviously, we know who the continuing NSFAS students are. So the students that are already in the system, that come back to university, that meet the financial and academic criteria, those students have been able to register for some time. The normal process applies where NSFAS would verify the registration data of those students with the institutions and then subsequently allow those students to register or at least recognize that they are to be funded. So we know those numbers of students. What we're not sure is the proportion of first-year students that will qualify, and that's the information that we will now be getting as first-year students are now being able to register. In fact, many institutions have already registered students, regardless of their funding status.
So, Dr. Lewin, even though you don't know how many exactly at this stage first-year students there will be, is there a guarantee that they will all be funded, at least all of those who qualify for NSFAS funding?
That's correct. That is, in fact, the decision that the commitment that Cabinet made, and that is the commitment that Minister Nzimande made yesterday when he spoke publicly, that the shortfall that we have anticipated is going to be covered, that we have to reprioritize funds from within the Department of Higher Education and Training budget in order to cover that shortfall. And yes, all students who qualify, who are NSFAS qualifying, which means they meet the financial eligibility criteria, that they end up registering in an approved program at a public university or TVET college, those students will be funded.
So we know that institutions have already started their registration, and there has been a call for them to extend the registration period by about 2 weeks. So please talk to us about that, because in light of the announcement that was made yesterday that you have just confirmed for us yet again with regard to first-year intake and those who qualify for NSFAS funding, how is it going to work? Because you still have first-year students who right now are still not sure about what is going on. So if they qualify, how do they know they qualify? Because the communication from NSFAS itself has been very sketchy with the students as well. So what is the process? How is all of this going to unfold now?
Okay, great. So how it works is that NSFAS works very closely with the institutions to inform them of the lists of students who have met the financial qualification criteria. And of course, that's the difficulty that NSFAS has had up until now. It has been unable to do that. So that information is then shared with institutions, and it allows institutions to be able to inform, and NSFAS to be able to inform those students that they have met the funding eligibility criteria, and then to be released for registration, because NSFAS students don't pay upfront registration fees. They are allowed to register. So as I say, continuing students, this hasn't affected them. But for new students, those decisions will now start flowing. And so students who may actually already have registered but are uncertain of their funding status, they will be able to get that confirmation over the next week or so as NSFAS begins to confirm those funding decisions. And they will work with institutions to provide that information to the students. So I really hope that over the next week that the levels of anxiety that we've been experiencing, and students have had been really anxious about this, that hopefully we should be able to see those decisions flowing, and students should be able to get that information very soon.
So looking at the current protests, Dr. Lewin, apologies, you hear the students talking about, historical debt and being excluded on the basis of that. So as a department, what is your handle on that situation first and foremost, and is there any sort of resolution in that regard?
So, okay, a few things. So, I mean, historic debt, there's a process that the department has been involved in with NSFAS to address the historic debt of NSFAS qualifying students. But there are, of course, many students that do not qualify for NSFAS and whose families struggle to afford the costs of higher education. Those are the students that are, we call them the missing middle students, but those are students whose families may struggle to get bank loans, but also do not qualify for NSFAS. And there are many students that fall into that category. So the challenge is that government funding at the moment has been targeted very much at addressing the support to students from poor and working class backgrounds, that the current threshold family income is 350,000 family income per year, and those students are fully subsidized. So since 2018, those students receive fully subsidized tuition fees. They receive support for other areas such as accommodation, learning materials, etc. Those students do not have debt, but of course we cannot as government and haven't been able to address all the funding needs of students, and there are many students who fall into other categories. What we are seeing is growing support for students in the missing middle through private bursary schemes, the non-profit schemes, the other kinds of funding that's available. But of course, it isn't adequate to address the needs of all students. What I should also indicate is that Cabinet, in its decision that was communicated yesterday, also requested the Department of Higher Education and Training to go and re-look at and do a policy review of the funding of students in higher education. And this is something that we really need to look at, is to look at the funding needs that we have in the system, both the funding needs for poor and working class students as well as for students in the missing middle, and to look at all of these needs in the system, as well as to look at the growing levels of student debt, and to think and review the policy around student funding and come back to Cabinet with proposals around that. So that is work that we will be doing quite intensively over the next few months.
Dr. Lewin, that sounds like a polite way of saying that, in fact, government cannot afford the current system in terms of providing free higher education for a lot of students in this country.
That is something that we need to go and look at. We have to be able to look at the sustainability of the scheme as a whole, and we have to be able to look at the student funding needs and see what can be afforded, and to be able to identify what those costs would be, and so that the work can be done to identify that funding, or indeed to look at the policy.
So, in everything that we've discussed thus far, Dr. Lewin, we're talking about decisions that have been taken, made at cabinet level, and this is sometimes where the devil comes in, where the detail is concerned, because now that decision needs to filter down to the implementation phase. Are you satisfied at this point that NSFAS has sufficient capacity to deal with all of these applications in the next 2 weeks, and to make sure that every deserving student actually gets the necessary communication and whatever else they may need from NSFAS's side within the next 2 weeks?
Yes, I am satisfied, and NSFAS has reassured us, and the institutions as well, that they will be able to do this. They are ready to make these decisions, and they are ready to communicate these decisions. And I know maybe that there is a public perception that in the past there have been administrative challenges at NSFAS, but many of these have been resolved. And over the last 2 years, we've been able to align the funding decisions that NSFAS makes with the start of the academic year and with the registration process at institutions. We have been communicating closely with institutions, working with the vice chancellors, and the registration period was extended in order to allow for this process to unfold. I'm sure that students are very anxious to get to class, but we are confident that we will be able to run a smooth registration process with NSFAS and with the institutions. And it is something that requires both sides. NSFAS has to confirm data with institutions. Institutions have to share data with NSFAS. But we're confident that we've made enormous progress in that area and that there shouldn't be too many delays. And in fact, institutions, once they know who the students are, they will be able to confirm those students. And the funding will flow in April when the subsidy comes to NSFAS, but the institutions will allow those students to register. Thanks.
And interesting that, you say that given what has been said about NSFAS of late, allegations of racism, nepotism, misconduct under the tenure of Administrator Randall Carolison, and he has now indicated that he needs protection because that situation seems to have gotten really ugly. So if NSFAS right now seems to be in a mess, this is the reason why I'm asking you that question in terms of whether they will be able to disperse those funds timeously and whether there's sufficient and effective communication between them and the institutions of higher learning.
There is, and NSFAS has had its challenges in the past. Maybe just to also inform you that the administration period has come to an end at the end of December. And NSFAS has a new board in place from the 1st of January, and it also has a new executive officer, Mr. Andile Nongogo. And many of the executive team have been in place for some time and have been managing these processes. So yes, there has been bad publicity, and there have been issues raised about the NSFAS administration period, but equally, the issues that I'm talking about in terms of the relationships that have been built with institutions, the data sharing platforms, the work that's gone on in the operations area of NSFAS is extremely strong. And we have, over the last 2 years, seen massive improvements in there. And I'm confident that NSFAS will be able to, under its current leadership, will be able to make these decisions as soon as possible.
So just a final question in terms of the way forward. Surely we don't want to be back here next year again with students protesting over the same old issues that they've been protesting about. So has there been any thought paid to that and how to improve the situation and the system such that we don't have these annual protests at the beginning of the academic year?
Yes, I think we really don't want that. I mean, I think we've seen a terrible tragedy this week, happening in Braamfontein, and we really worried about the levels of protest, and we're worried about the academic year. We had a terribly difficult academic year last year. There was, however, we saw great resilience among students and staff of the institutions, and we really hope that this year we can get through what is actually a very late start to the academic year and do so smoothly. So yes, I think that we are, as I said, we are entering into a process of looking at some of the policy issues, and we need to do that urgently so that we are able to ensure that the funding issues are identified, in terms of the medium-term budget process, which is also what the minister had discussed yesterday. And so that by the middle of the year, that we are very clear about these issues and that we have a way forward on some of the difficult issues around student debt, on how we might address the issues of missing middle funding, as well as how we remain sustainable over the long term in terms of the support, the critical support that government provides for students from poor and working class backgrounds. So we're going to be working very hard.
We appreciate your time this morning. Thank you to the Higher Education Deputy Director General Universities, Dr. Thandi Lewin, discussing with us the crisis in higher education funding and also a possible way forward given the events that transpired not only at Wits University but at institutions around the country. Let me hand you over to Leanne for